Hi, this is Andrew Collin with Critical Path Training. I'd like to take a few minutes to talk to you about the .NET Client Object Model in SharePoint 2010. Microsoft introduced the Client Object Model, three different ones, the .NET Client Object Model, Silverlight, and ECMAScript Client Object Models, to give customers more abilities to talk to SharePoint and to get data in and out of SharePoint from outside of code running on the SharePoint server. These different client object models are going to enable you to create custom applications that run off of a SharePoint server, or in the case of like Silverlight or ECMAScript, running within the browser that's not directly connected to SharePoint. This is going to allow you to much more easily get data in and out of SharePoint, working with a familiar object model that's very similar to what we're used to working with in the SharePoint server-side object model. So let's dive in. What I have here, instead of going through and building an application all from scratch in this screencast, which would take a significant amount of time, instead what I have is one that's already built. What it is just a WPF application that is going to show a list of product categories and products, and then show different information based on what's selected. So first, you see here I have a SharePoint site, just a standard team site, SharePoint 2010 team site. If I look at the product categories list that I've created, you'll see that we have 4 categories listed. What I then have is a list called products, and what a products list has is some products listed here on the title field. Each product has a product number and a price, and then I have a lookup field that points back to the product categories. Okay, so what I want to do is have an application that's going to show me categories. When I pick a category, it will then show me the products, and then when I click a product, it'll show me the details on that product. So if I go over here to Visual Studio 2010 and I just hit F5, let's take a look at the application here. So what you see here, I have Wingtip Product Browser. When I click Connect to Site, that's going to connect to the SharePoint site, and once it's finished connecting, it'll show me a list of all the categories inside the SharePoint list. So you see here I have all the different categories listed down the left-hand side. When I select one of the categories, it'll show me all the matching products. I just happen to pick one that has no products associated with it. If I pick components, you'll see there's a couple components here, clothing, there's some clothing stuff, and then as well as bikes. The way I've set this up is that I only go back to SharePoint every time I need data. So in this case, I need to go back and get the products. And so when I click on clothing, it's actually making a call back to SharePoint to get that data. When I pick one of the different products here, you'll see that it's going to go back to SharePoint and get the details on that product and show it down here at the bottom. I can even click Update Product, which will open a little dialog for me to go through and to change some of the information about this product. Click Update and it would save those changes. If I click Add, it'll allow me to go through and create a new product, such as an accessory. We'll create a bike bell. And then we'll just call it $4.99 so every kid can put it on their bike. And we'll put it as an accessory. When I click Add, it'll actually write back to SharePoint the information that I just added to this accessory, and you'll see there's my bike bell that we just created. And just to confirm, if I go back to my SharePoint site and refresh the products list, I'll see my bike bell. So how do we do all this? How is all this being done inside of the .NET Client Object Model? Let's go ahead and close this. Let's open up Visual Studio and we'll take a look at this. So what I have here is just the standard. I used Expression Blend 3 to go in and to create the UI for my application. No code or anything. I just created the event handlers for click events and stuff like that, and then just went through and saved the project and tested it that way. And then I jumped over to Visual Studio and opened the same solution to go through and add some code to it. Let me first show you some of the stuff that you're going to need to actually implement the .NET Client Object Model. First, you're going to need to add 2 references to a couple assemblies here in SharePoint. You're going to need to add a reference to the Microsoft.SharePoint.client assembly and as well as the client.runtime. Both of those can be found inside of the ISAPI folder and the SharePoint root. So if you go to C or wherever installation drive you put where you installed SharePoint, look at Program Files, Common Files, Microsoft Shared, look at the very bottom here for Web Server Extensions 14, and if I look under ISAPI, I'll find the 2 client DLLs. This is for the .NET Client Object Model. The first one is the actual object model. The second one is going to be that's going to handle all the plumbing and the communication from your client app back to SharePoint. The way the client object model works is that he's talking to something called the client service, the client.svc, which is going to do all the communication between SharePoint and the remote client object model. All right, so we need those two references. If I then go in and take a look at the code for this, now there's a lot of stuff that's specific to WPF here that I'm just going to skip over, and I'm going to focus just on the SharePoint client object model here. This application is available for download, so you can always go through and take a look at it and see how things work. And there's plenty of comments in it that walk you through and explain the different things that I'm doing here. So if we scroll down a little bit, what we're interested in is that when the application, when I click the connect button, so if I come down here and look at my connect site button right here, what you'll see, let's just switch this to full screen to see a little bit better. What you'll see here is that I'm first doing a check to see if we were connected, because if we were connected, then I want to disconnect, which is what I'm doing down here. But if I'm not connected, then what I want to do is to go do two things. First, or I guess three things. The first thing is I want to modify the UI of my application to make sure that people see that some work is being done. So I'm going to disable the text box where the URL is of the site. I'm going to disable the button as well, and then change the cursor to a waiting cursor. The next thing I'm going to do is I have this status bar, and I'm not sure if you noticed it, but when the application ran, I have a little status bar at the bottom of the app that I kind of write back to let people know what's going on. And it's just writing a little message to it. I'm then going to fire off a background thread that's going to do the work of connecting to and working with the .NET Client Object Model. And the reason for this is because when I'm waiting for a call back to SharePoint to come back, I don't want it to lock up my UI. So I'm going to do this on a background thread. I'm going to do that using the thread pool queue user work item, passing in a callback method, and then some data that I want to pass into it. So in this case, I'm going to call this worker method and then pass in the actual URL of the site that people want to connect to. So if I come down and take a look at this, what I'm doing is I'm going through and getting a reference to the URL inside that text box, and I'm going to use that to create a new instance of a client context. Now all this is because I'm in a .NET application, I'm going to use the client context multiple times. I'm just going to create one as a static object and then save that inside of a global reference here. So if I come over and take a look at the definition of this guy, I'm just creating a client context object from the .NET Client Object Model. And you'll see here I have another place too where I'm going to store all the product categories, because we're going to show those in a couple different controls as well. But my client context here, this is the hub for everything with the client object model. He's the one that's going to handle all the communication back and forth from the client object model and the and SharePoint. So what I'm going to do is say go first create a client context here. And now one thing to point out here is that the client object model is very smart in terms of how it caches things up, so that it doesn't automatically show all the content or doesn't automatically connect to SharePoint. I'm going to tell it when I want it to connect. So right now this is just a queued operation. So I'm going to say go create a client context, go get a reference to the root web in the site collection, and then I'm going to tell it I want to load the site object. So I'm going to initialize the site object, but the only thing I want to initialize on it is the title field. So I'm going to get a very lightweight SP web object, or a web object with the client object model. I'm going to get a very lightweight object back without all this extra stuff. This is just simply to confirm that I am connecting to a SharePoint site and that I have a valid that I've connected to a valid SharePoint site. The execute query is what's actually telling the client object model, go do the work that we just said and we just queued up in the client object model. So that's what we'll go through and get a reference or get a site object and then initialize that site object for me. Once I do that, I know that I am going to be connected. Of course, I should put a lot more error trapping in here and exception handling, but for the purposes of this demo, I just tried to make the code as clean as possible. But I'm just going to flag that I am now connected. And then because I can't update the UI from my background thread, I'm going to use this dispatcher, which is unique to WPF, to allow me to talk back to the UI thread. And what I'm going to do is on the begin invoke method, I'm going to pass back a delegate and say I want you to go run this method or go run this code inside the UI thread, and then says priority to normal. If I go look a little bit farther down here, you'll see that on the UI updater, I'm going to go through and just do some updating of the UI here, and then also say on connected status change, which what that will do is that actually will make some changes to some properties inside my UI. If I come back and take a look at this, what you see is that I have an is connected property, And then I've implemented some the event handlers and stuff that I need. Sorry, not right there, but I've implemented some stuff that I need right here, and then also at the very bottom on the iNotify property changed interface right here to tell SharePoint or to tell my application that the property is connected, just changed. Okay. Now what that's going to allow me to do is that if I go back and look at my WPF or my XAML file, what you'll see here is if I look down at like one of my list boxes, like we're looking at list box right here, I am able to bind the enabled property. I'm able to bind it to an element named window, which is this file right here, this class, the main window.xaml, and I'm going to say which property I want to go through and connect it. I want to bind it to is the is connected, so that the enabled status of this list box and this list box, and actually this entire control down here, user control down here, is going to be bound based on the is going to be enabled based on the value of the is connected property. The other thing that I want to point out to you is that once we're connected here, because you saw that once I did my on connected, where is that method? On connect site UI worker, you see that I'm raising an event here, or I'm calling a method here called on connected status changed. Now, what I did here at the very beginning of my project is that inside the initialization routine, I wired up the event connected status change, which is an event that I created. I'm wiring up that event handler to this method over here. Now, what this method is doing is he's saying, hey, when the connected status of my application changes, go ahead and call this load product categories. Load product categories, using the same background UI threading thing, is I'm going to say go load the categories from SharePoint. So I'm going to come over here to load product categories and take a look at this guy. He's running on a background thread. He's first going to get a reference to the product categories list and then create a camel query that is going to go, that's just going to simply say, give me all the items but sort them by title. And then I'm going to say, give me a list of all those items. Finally, I'm going to tell SharePoint, to the client object model, to initialize that object that I just was playing. I was just modifying, and then go execute the query. So this is where the work is going to be sent back to SharePoint. And then finally, on the UI on the updating thread, back on the UI updating thread, I'm going to tell it to, hey, look, if you actually got any categories, then I want you to set the source of that list box equal to the categories. So I'm going to bind the data, bind my list to that item source. Now, this is kind of interesting here, because the trick is, what we would like to do is just use standard data binding here. But if you notice here that I'm using my product categories object is of type list item collection. So that's going to use the same syntax of a collection of items that's going to look something like this: sp list item. If we were used to using the server side object model, and I wanted to get, say, like the price field out, I'd have to say something like this, right, to get the value out of the price piece. Well, because all the different fields are named fields inside this collection, I can't use just the generic binding inside of WPF. So what I've done here is I went through and I said, let's go through and create a new template pointing to the product category selector template. Now that's going to be defined as an application resource. So I'm going to go look to the app XAML, and let's take a look and see what this guy does. Here's the product category selector template. All he is just a stack panel that contains a bunch of a list box. So I'm putting a bunch of list boxes inside of, a bunch of text blocks inside of my list box. And then I'm going to say bind the data that's coming in, but I have to use this custom converter that I've created. What the converter is going to do, I call him my list item converter. He knows how to work with items inside of a SharePoint list item collection. So he's going to know how to go through and get specific fields out. So I'm going to say, when you have an item bound to this object here, I want you to call the list item converter and pass in the parameter of title. Title saying this is the field that I want to show. Well, I've defined that converter up here as a local resource. So here's my list item converter. Actually, first create a new namespace here for local and said, look, it's going to be referencing the CLR namespace of product browser. Okay. Now my object is called the list item converter. So if I go look at the code, here's my list item converter. The list item converter is the thing that's going to take in a list item. So what I want to do here on the convert method, I need to go in and say, all right, well, let's first go get the list item the list items field that we want to display. So in this case, we passed in title, which was the parameter that was coming in, the converter parameter. But just in case, if they didn't actually specify one, we're going to default to title. I then need to get a reference to the item that's being bound to this list box's item. So I'm going to say, go take the item that's being bound to us. We know he's going to be of type SP of the client object model list item here. So I'm going to say, go cast that as a list item, and then make sure that that's actually what we got back. If it comes back as null, then something else was bound to it, and this converter is specific to list items. So we're going to throw a problem here saying that you can't go through and use anything but a list item. Now, if I just jump ahead a little bit, we'll skip this at first, and you'll see I just write out the list items field that actually came back. The other trick, though, is I want to have a way to go through and use lookups. And so this code right here just says, hey, look, if you have the syntax of lookup dot and then the field name in the parameter, then I'm going to go through and use that as I'm going to convert this to a lookup field and look at the lookup field's value. You can see where that's being used over on the, I think, the product details control, where my product categories, those are lookup fields. And so you see I just said, hey, go through and use lookup.category. And so it would find this and say, oh, you're looking for a lookup field. Okay. One of the other cool things about this is the ability to do some really easy data binding. So you'll see here that if I look at the code here on the main window, if I go through and find the on product selected, let's go find that on product category. Let me find my method here. On product details, product selected, product list box selection changed. So this guy here, this is handling when I actually select a product from the list box. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to do the same thing where I'm using this whole threading thing of working with the background thread. You'll see that I'm first going through and on the product change worker, I'm actually selecting a product. So I'm saying go get a product by its title. Okay, standard camel query right there. We've already gone through how we're selecting data in SharePoint, so I'm not going to go through and spend any time there. The interesting thing, though, is on this product change UI updater. What I can do is go into the product details, which that is my user control that I've defined. That this blue user control right here, right? That's going to show the details of a selected product. I'm going to say if you actually got a product back, then go bind that list item to the data context of my product details. Now, what's cool about that is because in WPF, every object has a data context, or every object that has a data context, by default will inherit the context of his parent. So by just doing this, I can then go into my product details and use standard data binding syntax here to say, go through and bind the text property of the product name text box, which is right here. Go bind him to the title field on the item that's bound to this of the data context of this control, which is the data context of the entire user control, because I didn't make any changes to it. Okay. What's even cooler about this is that I can even pass this even farther down by looking at the code for this guy and say that, hey, when you click the update button, set the data context of the dialog that pops up to the same data context of this guy, of the user control. And then when I make changes inside of that pop-up box, the data will actually be changed inside the list item that's being in the context of this dialog, which means it's also changing the same thing of the user control. And because it's changing the same thing of the user control, it's also going to change it inside of the hosting main window as well. So that when I come back and look at the code for this guy to say that when we actually made the change, when I look at the code for the product details and I look at the update closed event, which we wired up right here, so say when the dialog is closed, go call this method. When I look at the update closed event, what you'll see here is that I'm getting a reference to the dialog, and then I'm having to go in and just do a little check here to go get the actual category, because the drop-down list isn't creating an exact reference to the lookup field, so I have to go create that myself. So I'm getting a reference to the actual category that was selected, and then just coming down here inside the worker and saying, oh, we'll go set the category field of the product that we currently have selected to this guy right here, because let's back up a little bit. You see the inside the closed method, I'm actually passing the data context as an object into the worker, and then I'm converting that to a list item, right? And then I'm going to go update the category and then save my changes like I would in the standard SharePoint object model, and then say execute query, and that will then go through and save my changes back to SharePoint. Same thing works for the add. A little bit differently with the add method though, because the add method, the data context doesn't exactly work because I don't have an SP list item that I've bound to the object or bound to the dialog. So I have to go back and actually create the object myself, create the list item myself. The creation of items inside of SharePoint using the client object model is handled using these creation information objects. So you see I'm getting a reference to the products list, then going through and creating a creation information object, actually adding the item to the list and getting an item back, this new product, and then updating all of his fields, and then just calling update and then execute query to go through and save my changes. That's basically it. I just wanted to show you how to connect to a SharePoint site, how to use, how to select data and get data out of a SharePoint site, and then also update it and add data. And then finally, I wanted to show you some cool little data binding tricks with WPF when you're using the client object model. So I hope you got a lot out of this.